Today we're beginning a short series on modern prophets. Prophets are people who speak for God. And they differ from pastors, people like me who teach and guide a spiritual community. Prophets tend to call religious leaders and communities to account. Jesus once said that prophets aren't welcome in their own hometowns because sometimes they say things that irritate us. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be hearing from three modern prophets. I've had the opportunity to meet all three of these people. And today I want to introduce you to Rachel Held Evans, who I met at a church conference in Denver a few years ago. When I put on my initial plans together for this series over a year ago, it was shortly before Rachel's sudden death at age 37. Over 100,000 people took part in her funeral. Her prophetic voice continues to speak to the church in this nation as the number of church communities dwindle. She was a millennial mom with a message that resonated with so many. So here she is.
So the issue everyone wants me to talk about these days is how to keep young people in the church and how to understand and communicate the value of church in a culture that is increasingly considering it irrelevant. And what I want to suggest to you today is that you already know the answer to that question. We already know the answer to that question. And contrary to popular belief, it's not about making the church more hip. It's not about adding coffee shops in the lobby and fog machines on the stage. It's not about pastors who wear skinny jeans and wear Christian t-shirts ironically and use the word disrupt a lot. It's about communion. It's about baptism. It's about confession. It's about healing. It's about death and resurrection and all the weird, beautiful things the church has always been doing. It's the stuff we already know how to do, as long as we just kind of get out of our own way. So I've titled this talk, Keep the Church Weird. And if you've ever been to Austin, Texas, you get off the airplane and you immediately see a gift shop that has a bunch of t-shirts that say, Keep Austin Weird. Kind of preserve the craziness of that town. Then Portland went and stole it because, Portland, a bunch of wannabe hipsters out there. So they do the Keep Portland Weirds. But my point is that we got to keep the church weird, and that reaching millennials, reaching my generation, reaching 20-somethings and young adults, reaching anyone really isn't about making the church more cool. It's about keeping the church weird. And I'm often asked to speak on this topic to pastors and folks in church leadership. So I usually start off by telling them a little bit of my own story about growing up in church, getting frustrated with church, and struggling to fit into church. And then I go through some of the reasons millennials say they are leaving the church based on research from Dave Kinnaman and the Barna Group, from Pew Forum, and several other survey groups. And this is where I step on a few toes, because I tell them millennials say they're tired of the culture wars. They're tired of Christianity getting all entangled with party politics and with power. I tell them that we don't want to feel like we have to choose between science and religion, or between our intellectual integrity and our faith, or our emotional integrity and our faith. I tell them we want the church to be a safe place to doubt, a safe place to wrestle with tough questions without predetermined answers. And I tell them we want our gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender friends to be welcome in the church, not treated as second-class citizens. I tell them we care about social justice, gender equality, creation care, racial reconciliation, and we want the church to care about those things too. And we recognize that both Jesus without social justice and social justice without Jesus basically renders the church unnecessary. And I tell them that sometimes we just struggle to see how the church is relevant in our everyday lives.
There is a story from the early days of Christ's church an Ethiopian man on his way home from Jerusalem, where he had come to worship. He was a eunuch and an official responsible for the entire treasury of Queen Candace of Ethiopia. Philip, a follower of Jesus, was moved to approach the man's carriage and found him reading a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. As a eunuch, this man was unclean in the law and not allowed to enter the temple. He was also a foreigner. Even so, Philip traveled away with him and told him about Jesus and the impact that Jesus had made on him. As they went down the road, Philip and the Ethiopian came to some water. The eunuch said, "Look, water. What would keep me from being baptized?"
And for a split second, Philip might have thought, well, your anatomy for one thing, your ethnicity, your status as an outsider, your lack of education in the law. But Philip didn't say any of those things. Without another word, he baptizes the Ethiopian eunuch in the first body of water that they come upon. He got out of the way. He remembered that what makes the gospel offensive isn't who it leaves out, it's who it lets in. Starting with you and me, really. But we religious types aren't very good at getting out of the way, are we? We're much better at building walls. We're much better at retreating into temples. We're better at making mountains out of our ideologies and our rules and our legalism. But there's this voice calling from the wilderness: prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight, tear down the mountains, smooth out a path, get out of the way, and God will move. And I wonder sometimes if this is what Jesus meant when he said that with enough faith we can move mountains. Because sometimes the hardest mountains to move are the ones of our own making, right? So, spoiler alert, I don't know how to bring millennials back to the church. I don't know how to confront the growing secularism in our culture, but I know that Jesus is sufficient. I know that Jesus is enough, and if Jesus says that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, I think it will probably survive the information age. And I know that sometimes the hardest thing is just to make ourselves get out of the way and to let God do God's work. So everyone's got an opinion these days about why people are leaving the church. Some wish to solve the problem by making Christianity a little more palatable. You know, cut out all this weird mystical stuff about sin, demons, and death and resurrection, and replace it with self-help books or politics or fancy theological systems. But sometimes I think that what the church needs most is to recover some of its weird. There's no sense in sending her through the makeover montage of the chick flick when she'll always be the strange, awkward girl who only gets invited to prom on a dare. In the ritual of baptism, our ancestors acted out the bizarre truth of the Christian identity. We are people who stand totally exposed before evil and death and declare them powerless against love. There's nothing normal about that. And in talking with people who have embraced this concept, it's really cool to see how people have incorporated this into their own baptismal services, whether it's for adults or children. A pastor told me about how, you know how you parade the little kid around like, look at this adorable child? They said part of that for them is they bring out the child, or this is a church that has a large homeless ministry, and so a lot of homeless folks are also getting baptized right alongside the children. And they bring the person out who's been baptized, and they say, the world is going to name this person homeless, alone, forgotten, whatever. But today we name him a beloved child of God. And they do this for the children too. And I think that's a nice way to sort of acknowledge what baptism is all about. It's not about earning your way into the family of God. It's about being part of the family of God from the get-go. It's about being beloved from the get-go. We are called to be in the healing business. It's not the curing business. And there's a difference between curing and healing. So I'm going to read a little bit from that. Claire loved her busy metropolitan church. It was where she connected with her best friends, where she met her husband, where she supported and served a homeless ministry, where she fit. When her husband secured a job on the church staff and Claire learned she was pregnant, life seemed to be falling into place. She writes, 2 months before the baby was born, our house flooded and we had to move out. 1 month before the baby was born, my parked car was hit and rendered undrivable. One day before the baby was born, he stopped moving. She writes, "I didn't know that healthy full-term babies could be born stillborn. I went to the hospital with hope and fear, but they never found a heartbeat." The church rallied, helping with funeral costs and meals, even providing a cabin for a weekend getaway for Claire and her husband. But when the couple returned to face down the long and arduous journey through grief, they found themselves alone. "There are no worship songs for mourning a traumatic death," Claire wrote. "There's no testimony time about feeling forsaken when God doesn't intervene to save the life of a baby. We wanted so desperately for our church and our pastor to struggle with us, to question, to face this ugly, brutal truth." But she says that her agony was met largely by platitudes, Bible verses, theological answers, promises of better days ahead. Claire eventually found healing outside the walls of the church, in counseling among a couple of close friends, and on internet forums where faith, doubt, and grief were discussed more openly. Eventually, she and her husband connected to another church, but Claire still finds herself struggling to worship at times. I get a lot of emails from people like Claire, people who fit right into church until the divorce, until the diagnosis, until the miscarriage, until the depression, until someone comes out, until someone asks a question, until an uncomfortable truth is spoken out loud. And what they find is that when they bring their pain or their doubt or their uncomfortable truth to church, someone immediately grabs it out of their hands to try and fix it, to try and make it go away. Bible verses are quoted, assurances are given, plans with 10 steps and measurable results are made. With good intentions tinged with fear, Christians scour their inventory for a cure. But there's a difference between curing and healing. And I believe the church is called to the slow and difficult work of healing. We're called to enter into one another's pain, anoint it as holy, and stick around no matter the outcome. The thing about healing, as opposed to curing, is that it's relational. It takes time. It's inefficient, like a meandering river. Rarely does healing follow a straight or well-lit path. Rarely does it conform to our expectations or resolve in a timely manner. Walking with someone through grief or through the process of reconciliation requires patience, presence, and a willingness to wander, to take the scenic route. But the modern day church doesn't like to wander or wait. The modern day church likes results. Convinced the gospel is a product we've got to sell to an increasingly shrinking market, we like our people to function as walking advertisements. Happy, put together, finished, proof that this Jesus stuff works. At best, such a culture generates pews of Stepford Wives-style robots with painted smiles and programmed moves. At its worst, it creates environments where abuse and corruption get covered up to protect reputations and preserve image. The world is watching, Christians like to say, so let's be on our best behavior and quick hide the mess. Let's throw up some before and after shots and roll that flashy footage of our miracle product, blanching out every sign of dirt, hiding every sign of disease. But if the world is watching, we might as well tell them the truth. And the truth is, the church doesn't offer a cure. It doesn't offer a quick fix. The church offers death and resurrection. The church offers the messy, inconvenient, gut-wrenching, never-ending work of healing and reconciliation. The church offers grace. And anything else we try to peddle is snake oil. It's not the real thing. Brené Brown puts it like this. She says, "I went to church thinking it would be like an epidural, that it would take the pain away. But church isn't like an epidural. It's like a midwife." I thought faith would say, "I take away the pain and discomfort," but what it ended up saying was, "I'll sit with you in it." Which brings me to my very final point, and that is, folks, don't be afraid of death. Let's talk about death, folks. There's a lot of nerves and hand-wringing and worrying right now about the future of the church and how the church in North America is dying. We're losing all of our money. We're losing all of our power. We're losing all of our influence. And what I want to encourage you all with today is that death is something empires worry about. It's not something resurrection people worry about. So maybe all this change in the church means that our empire building days are over. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it means that God is doing what God is always doing, and that's making something new. Chesterton said, "Christendom has had a series of revolutions, and in each one of them, Christianity has died. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave." So I don't know what this death and resurrection is going to look like, but I hope that this resurrecting of a new church in a new age looks like altars transforming into tables, gates transforming into open doors, cure-alls transforming into healing oils. And I hope it looks like a kingdom that belongs not to the rich, but to the poor, not to the triumphant, but to the weak, not to the culture warriors, but to the peacemakers. If Christianity as we know it must die, may it die to the old ways of dominance and control and be resurrected into the way of Jesus, resurrected to the way of the cross.
Rachel preached a message of resurrection. What did you think of her message? What did this modern prophet have to say that made you feel uncomfortable? Where did you hear hope? Being church is changing rapidly. There is no roadmap. There is no magic solution. But Jesus is enough. The power of blessing to transform lives is enough. A wise person in this church community once said that God's Spirit is like energy. We cannot create it, and we can certainly not destroy it. What we can do is work with that power to bless, to be a community that attempts to live in spirit and in truth, to work for healing, to try to live Jesus' core values of nonviolence, justice and mercy, compassion, and inclusivity in every aspect of our lives. And that is enough. Will you pray with me? Holy Spirit, Spirit of Christ, Spirit that is within me, we are living through so much change. Help us not fear death. Lead us with a sense that you are with us, and that is enough. Trusting in your holy way, we know the hope of new life and light on the other side of our present darkness. That is the truth that goes with us always. Amen.